It's kind of unsettling how one specific part of modern life keeps rearing its ugly head in the exact same way regardless of the verisimilitude of the interpretation.
Ow! Careful! Don't squeak! You can't do this! He's shooting at me! Why is he shooting at me? Guys, she's... Police brutality!
What is up with animated films and their obsession with portraying some form of police control? What does it say about us as a society that it's basically impossible to portray the modern world, even in the most abstract sense, without this coming up? No, like, seriously, that wasn't rhetorical. I'm asking, what does it say about us?
This question Eliquorice presents is valid. Recent animated children's films seem incapable of presenting law enforcement officers in their imagined worlds without alluding to police brutality and public mistrust. In an essay I wrote half a decade ago, I stated, "Gone are the days of hopeful utopian depictions of the future like Disney's animated movie, Meet the Robinsons."
Special Agent Wilbur Robinson of the TCTF.
The what?
Time Continuum Task Force. I'm here to protect you.
They've been replaced by dystopian fiction which expresses a world that is much darker and in some sense, more realistic. However, back then I was talking about teen live-action films, not children's films, much less animated ones. The distinction between these two age ratings is based on the fact that, to some degree, society wants to shield children from messages that may be beyond what their innocent minds should be worrying about. The only time when we allow grave messages to be embedded in kids' works is when we feel those messages are crucial to their well-being and survival. For example, Little Red Riding Hood advises children not to stray from the tried and true path for fear of being eaten alive, and Disney's Tangled encourages children to trust their instincts to flee when someone is holding them against their will by gaslighting them. So when negative police depictions appear alongside these other moral lessons, the takeaway message here is that we as a society feel that police brutality and misconduct is such a given, such an inarguable facet of the way the world works, that obviously children must be warned about it for their own safety. I argue that in a similar way to how Baumgartner et al. Used New York Times media coverage of innocence framing to map public opinion on the death penalty, one could use negative depictions of cops in children's films to map growing public mistrust of the police. In order to convince you of this possibility, we must first define the relationship between the fantasy/science fiction genres and social commentary, and then explore three key concepts of film theory associated with these two genres: extrapolation, interpolation, and allegory. Science fiction and fantasy often take real-world issues and reimagine them as fantastical conflicts or world-building elements that must be overcome. As Christopher McKitterick suggests, one of science fiction's greatest tools is the literal metaphor, where an actual literal thing in the story can stand in metaphorically for something in our world as a means to critique that thing without immediately throwing up defensive walls. Examples of this include Lord of the Rings being an allegory of the Cold War and Akira being an allegory of the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki during World War II. Now there's a lot of contention between how much weight we as an audience should place on these parallels. After all, we don't want to dissect something to the point where we turn it into something it was never about just because we can argue that there is a possible connection. That's why during this video, I encourage you to be an active participant. Question the films, my claims, and your own emotional reactions to all of the information. At the end of this, you yourself can decide if there's validity in these interpretations. The first lens or film theory we will look through is extrapolation. Extrapolation is a kind of hypothesis. You examine real-world trends in regard to a certain social area and you imagine a worst-case scenario if that trend were to continue. If you're imagining George Orwell's 1984 or Lois Laurie's The Giver, yes, that exactly. We can see this trend clearly by using the film Coco. Coco imagines the land of the dead, or the afterlife, as a hierarchical society like our own. The dearly departed who are remembered by many are financially advantaged like the upper class. They live lavish lives and stand at the pinnacle of society. Below them are the middle-class citizens who are remembered by only a few. That still allows them to have some degree of comfort, because they do not have to constantly worry about starvation and oblivion. Finally, beneath the middle class are the working or lower class, those who are on the path to being fully forgotten. These individuals do not have their pictures on any ofrendas or altars. They live in destitute conditions and in constant fear that they will eventually turn to dust. The most insidious part about this is that, unlike in the real world, these people could have in theory lived forever if only there was someone living who bothered to pay them respect. In the Land of the Dead, these class distinctions are reinforced by border control officers who regulate who comes and goes during the Day of the Dead, or the day that the dead are allowed to walk among the living. Only those who have a living relative who has chosen to honor them are allowed to visit their relatives during this important cultural holiday. Police officers are, in this way, depicted as the barrier to happiness. It is great when the officers are able to allow people to pass, but their presence, cooperative or not, is literally the gateway to the current plot objective at every moment.
No photo on a friend, no crossing the bridge.
For this reason, there's a persistent apprehension whenever they are around, and being caught by them is a major fear of the main character, Miguel. If they were to detain him, it would impede his goal of returning to the land of the living before he is permanently trapped in the land of the dead, because he knows that the police officers would not listen to him. These major themes of regulating who belongs where and the threat of being wrongfully detained can be read through the context of harsh immigration regulations in the US and the use of modern detainment centers that eerily reflect the American concentration camps used against Japanese Americans during World War II, euphemized as internment camps. The second lens we will look through is interpolation.
Red Riding Hood. You probably know the story.
Interpolation is kind of like the opposite of extrapolation. Where extrapolation knows points A and B and imagines C, interpolation draws conclusions about what might exist between points A and B that we're not quite sure of yet. In other words, interpolation is about expanding on the unknown between the known. We can see this clearly by using the film Wreck-It Ralph, which likens villains to real-world criminals in that both groups are ostracized from quote-unquote average citizens. The viewing port of arcade games is depicted to be a window into an infinite world. Everything between that window and the playable elements of the game is left up for interpretation, like the scenes between plot points in a book that were not explicitly stated. This concept is further developed by allowing the game characters to hang out with characters from other games in the power strip during their downtime. This is the literal manifestation of an interpolated world within technological existence. The metaphorical in-between, unseen to the human eye, and that gray area gives way to the classification of villains and heroes. Ralph, the main character of the movie, is a bad guy. But here's the question. Would the citizens of the Wreck-It Ralph game know what a bad guy was without having something to compare Ralph to in other games? That same concept can be applied to people who have been convicted in our society. It is only by comparison that classification can exist, and that classification, which is often arbitrary, has long-lasting effects on the rights a certain game character has in the larger universe.
I don't want to be the bad guy anymore.
Restrictions on where they are legally allowed to go, what police officers are able to do to them, where they are socially expected to exclude themselves from, and how the real-world people playing them feel about their victories are all decided on whether they fit into the category of hero or villain. But those words do not account for the distinction between a petty thief and a murderer, a cannibal and a fighter, a zombie and a pixelated ghost. They are all just given the blanket statement label of villain regardless of the degree of their crime. And this is largely based on framing. Whoever stands in the way of the objective of the game, or society in our case, is the villain. Thus, if the larger scheme of society is evil, goodwill becomes a crime. The struggles Ralph faces, like loneliness and partial homelessness because he still belongs in a game, he just isn't welcome to live anywhere decent within it, are meant to draw sympathy to this bad guy and judgment towards the citizens and the law enforcement officers that attempt to bar him from living a life for things beyond his control.
They go to their homes, I go to mine, which happens to be a dump. An actual dump where the garbage goes and a bunch of bricks, smashed building parts. That's what I call home.
Wreck-It Ralph demands from viewers that we question the systems in place that naturally make us more inclined to criminalize certain people over others, as well as the systems that may be turning people into villains, such as poverty and discrimination. In the words of Martin Luther King Jr., we must be concerned not merely about who murdered them, but about the system, the way of life, the philosophy which produced the murderers. The third and final lens we will look through is allegory. An allegory in film, just as it is in literature, is the use of symbolism or substitution to comment on an aspect of human existence. If you're thinking George Orwell's Animal Farm, once again, yes, that exactly. We can see this lens clearly by using the film Sing, which does not reimagine our world so much as it takes animals and puts them directly in our place within our pre-existing social structures. By replacing humans with an entity that is, in theory, more objective to our perception than we are, we as an audience can less subjectively analyze our own mortal flaws and shortcomings, while still laughing through most of the film. That being said, the film uses the pressure of belonging to a gang of gorillas as an allegory for the pressure of being in the family business. Johnny, a musically inclined black gorilla, yeah, is the black sheep of his family. He has trouble envisioning himself taking over his father's role as the gang leader, and struggles to accomplish beginner tasks his father assigns him as preparation for his future.
Barry's always been our driver.
Barry don't mind, do you, Barry?
Johnny's father explicitly calls their group a gang on several occasions throughout the film.
It's time my boy had a proper role in the gang.
And they are constantly running and hiding from the cops while carrying out their day-to-day activities. Don't get me wrong, scene does not necessarily encourage criminal behavior. It just depicts it as a normal part of Johnny's life, in the same way that you would imagine a father reliving his glory days by pressuring his son to do exceptional at sports in a teen film. You know, get your head in the game. For this reason, the major conflict here is just that Johnny can't see his father's life for himself. He doesn't judge his father, and he never rats his family out or anything cringeworthy like that. Rather, his father gets arrested because Johnny got caught up in his own dreams and wasn't there when he said he would be. He didn't keep his word. In this way, law enforcement officers do not uphold justice, but rather act as a means of further tearing the family apart. The film actively mourns this rather than celebrating the incarceration. The physical prison that detains Johnny's father alludes to the pain of absent fathers disproportionately torn away from their families in many marginalized communities. Because of this detainment and his personal feelings about the validity of pursuing a music career, Johnny's father is expected to miss the moment the entire film has been building up to, Johnny's musical debut. But in a turn of events, Johnny's father breaks out of prison like Iroh breaking out of his cell in Avatar: The Last Airbender. He heroically scales rooftops and dodges helicopters full of cops, searching to drag him back to prison, all just to get to his son's performance and be there to cheer him on in person. The police officers, though they are never antagonized, are once again a clear obstacle. Thankfully, Johnny's father makes it and the father-son duo are able to make amends. Now, scene lends itself to an additional fourth lens that magnifies the real-world application for the previous three: race. I have my reservations about depicting a clearly black family as gorillas, shame on you, Sing, so I'll use a different film to talk about it: Zootopia. Zootopia creates an allegory for the concept of civilization by showing a society polarized between the race distinctions of predator and prey. At first, we are led to believe that prey animals represent marginalized identities and predatory animals make up the dominant culture due to their natural strength and size that allow them to waltz into positions of power. However, as the plot progresses, we see that predators are often judged as savage and told to go back to the forest, as seen by an angry pig protester yelling these words at a peace rally.
Go back to the forest, predator!
I'm from the savannah!
Which, let's be honest, sounds pretty racist. The biology of predators is politicized and framed as dangerous in the media, which leads to hate speech and discrimination against them.
It may have something to do with biology.
What do you mean by that?
Furthermore, because of this negative media attention, the police stop helping those in need, the predators who are being attacked, and instead turn on predators in their own ranks, forcing them to take less visible jobs to appease the public eye. When I looked at this picture, it broke my heart, because all I could think of was the negative portrayal of black and darker skinned men in the media. So often are black bodies depicted as aggressive or hostile even when they are doing absolutely nothing wrong. The fear that the innocent predators in Zootopia felt when they were being targeted and simultaneously blamed for it by law enforcement officers alludes to the lack of trust that many people of color feel towards the police because of racial profiling. Will they help me? Or will they shoot first and ask questions later? With all of that being said, I now ask you, do you think negative depictions of cops in children's films could be used to map public opinion of the police? Why or why not?